Good afternoon. I'm Francis Levy. Ed Nersessian and I are co-directors of the Philoctetes Center. And welcome to the Politics and Psychobiology of Genocide. Before we begin, I have several other announcements which pale in the face of that announcement, of that film. But I will proceed anyway. As you all know, Philoctetes Center has been under a lot of stress due to the current financial situation. So again, I want to thank our panelists for doing this this afternoon and donating their time. And I want to thank all those of you who have contributed to the Philoctetes Center. If you are interested in any of our programs, please come forth. We stream, as you know, we stream all Philoctetes events. So this particular event is online. If you go to the Philoctetes site, www.philoctetes.org, you are seeing this right now. And we videotape all the events with our 3-camera setup, so they are archived. And you go to past programming on our site, and in about 3 days you can see this particular program. So if any of our areas, poetry, music, roundtables, any of these interest you, please come forth. We've appreciated and are living off the checks and donations that we are receiving now, and we're applying for grants at the same time. But there's a period of about a year before we can get grants if we succeed in doing so. And in that period of time is the danger period. So we're going from hand to mouth right now. The current show on aggression features the photography of Alexander Gibbon and ties in with, obviously, the Voices of Miranda film segment that you just saw. And I want to thank Taylor Krauss for bringing that today. In addition, the painting over there and several of the other paintings are by Margaret Rolicky. We have the Joy Garnett's paintings and Robert Tooze's paintings. Have I left anyone else out? And Joyce Kozlov's collages on that side of the room. So this whole show has been curated by Hallie Cohn and Adam Ludwig. So now I'm pleased to introduce Benedict Kiernan. Benedict Kiernan is the Whitney Griswold Professor of History, Professor of International and Area Studies, and Director of the Genocide Studies Program at Yale University. He is the author of Blood and Soil, A World History of Genocide and Extermination from Sparta to Darfur, which won the 2008 Gold Medal for Best Book in History, awarded by the Independent Publishers Association. He also wrote Genocide and Resistance in Southeast Asia, Documentation, Denial, and Justice in Cambodia and East Timor. How Pol Pot Came to Power, Colonialism, Nationalism, and Communism in Cambodia, 1930 to 1975, and the Pol Pot Regime, Race, Power, and Genocide in Cambodia under the Khmer Rouge, 1975-1979. Professor Kiernan will moderate this afternoon's panel and introduce our other distinguished guests. So thank you very much, Professor Kiernan.
It's a great pleasure to be here on this terrifying topic, as you've just seen. Taylor Krauss's very moving video. Today we're going to have a roundtable, an interdisciplinary roundtable discussion involving an educationalist, a filmmaker, a novelist, a psychiatrist, and a historian. I'm filling in as moderator for Helen Fine. It's a great pity that she was ill and unable to come today, I think, because Helen Fine is one of the founders of genocide studies in this country and has devoted her career to the study of genocide, and she's a sociologist and would have added another perspective. She's the author most recently of Human Rights and Wrongs, Slavery, Terror and Genocide, as well as 2 other books on genocide. And with Leo Cooper, she really has been responsible over the last 30 years in launching the field of the study of genocide. And unfortunately, I have to make a statement about the tragic loss of Alison Desforges, who died in the plane crash in Buffalo recently. She was the definitive documenter of the Rwandan genocide, and she devoted her life to the study of human rights in Africa, working with Human Rights Watch. And her book, which she published in 1999, Leave None to Tell the Story, really is the pioneering documentation of the Rwandan genocide. And she went on to continue to report human rights violations in Rwanda and also Burundi, and most recently in Congo. And she even led the way to the study of the ongoing genocide in Darfur. Now, in the interests of a roundtable format, I've asked each of the panelists to make a short 5-minute presentation going around the table. And I'm going to start with Taylor Krauss, whose video you have just seen. He's an independent documentary filmmaker who worked under Ken Burns on the 7-part series The War, about the Second World War. He's a graduate of Yale University with a degree in film studies, and he's spent the last 2.5 years in Rwanda as executive director of Voices of Rwanda, filming testimonies, some of which you've just seen, which are going to be used for genocide education. So I'll ask Taylor Krauss to make the first presentation.
Thanks, Professor Kiernan. I think, firstly, Professor Kiernan is among the individuals who 3 years ago said to us that because this process was not happening in Rwanda, that nobody was actually listening to survivors, nobody is recording testimonies, that in part we had an obligation to do so. So it's the work that we've been doing for the last 3 years in Rwanda is actually was also spurred on by Professor Kiernan, so I'm very thankful for that and for his advice when we began this process, and now to find myself at a round table with these scholars who have written and researched these topics and lived through through genocide. You know, I came to this subject in 2004 in a way, my first trip to Rwanda. Of course, I had grown up hearing about the Holocaust and hearing about genocide, but it was that trip to Rwanda that really informed the fact that I'm now living in Rwanda and that we're collecting testimonies. And I think it's appropriate to have this roundtable here at the Philoctetes Center now, especially after the passing of Alison Deforge and on the eve of the 15th anniversary of the Rwandan genocide next month. As I'm not a historian, nor an academic, but a documentary filmmaker, I think I wanted to come to the idea that since my world is about narrative and stories, that in fact ideas and myth can kill. And this is directly taken from Prunier, who writes that ideas and myth can directly result in killing. And as referenced in the chapter on the Rwandan genocide in Professor Kiernan's recent book. I think it's important to contextualize the Rwandan genocide in broader Rwandan history, not just having occurred over the course of 3 months, but a longer history of violence in order to understand how ideas and myth actually ultimately led to killing. If we go back in time, back to before colonialism, we can look at Rwandan society as broken down into a social class system where you had an elite Tutsi minority, 14% of the population, and a majority population, the Hutu majority, about 85% of the population, and the Twa, or the Pygmy population. And these social class distinctions between the Hutu and Tutsi were actually very porous. You could become a Tutsi if you gained cattle, you could become a Hutu, but it was only until after World War I, when the colony was handed over to the Belgians, and during that period of time leading up to the Second World War, that you had anthropologists and colonialists coming in with their ideas of and myths of the origins of the Tutsi and the origins of the Hutu. And ultimately, those were myths that were put in place in Rwandan society that contributed to propaganda and dehumanization and outsiderness during and leading up to the genocide in Rwanda. I can speak more specifically, but there is the time that ideas and myths lead to genocide.
Okay, next we're going to hear from Joyce Apsel, who's a master teacher of humanities in the Liberal Studies program at NYU and founder and director of Rights Works International, which is a human rights education project. She's past president of the International Association of Genocide Scholars and editor of Darfur, Genocide Before Our Eyes, and co-editor with Helen Fine of Teaching About Genocide. Joyce Apsel.
Leo Cooper, who Ben Kiernan mentioned as one of the founding figures of genocide, wrote in one of his books that while animals engage in interspecies killing, genocide is primarily a human crime. I've been teaching about genocide for the last 3 decades, and I've also been teaching about peace. There's much more interest in genocide than there is in peace. I thought that I would just give a few comments on some of the ironies and paradoxes of thinking about the politics and psychobiology of genocide, it's rather fitting that the last forum here was about war, because war and genocide are often appear together. The term genocide itself has produced a vocabulary of violence, a veritable lexicon. We don't have the same thing of a lexicon of peace, parsing destruction, politicide, eliticide, omnicide, democide, for example. The term genocide is often coveted by different groups in the sense that those who have suffered death and destruction want their history, their cause, to carry the genocidal label. Because in modern parlance, genocide is often seen as the crime of crimes. It's kind of an irony. We know from studies of genocide that it is a complicated and multi-causal process. Also that it is repeated over and over again. The video testimonies we saw in Rwanda, the methods and processes, the terms chopping, wounds. We have seen bodily integrity invaded over and over again, so that we understand that the genocidal process is one that is worldwide and is not distinctive to one community, to one class. Vulnerability, humiliation, loss among individuals, societies, and nations of sense of self, human attributes of aggression, domination, power, masochism, and may I add, terrible human inventiveness and creativity and ritual also are part of the patterns of genocide across boundaries. The methods of destruction we see repeated from the most ancient of times to the present. And while there are those who argue about the modernity of genocide, and there are certain features of the modernity of genocide, what we also see is the desecration, dehumanization, wounding, and terrible devastation that genocide brings, not only to its immediate victims, but of course to destroy future generations as well. So genocide is a complex phenomenon. It is one that crosses boundaries. And my question, one of the things I would love to talk about is, we have been teaching about atrocity for a very long time. People need to hear the testimony and voices of different victims of genocide. But we also have to think about other ways to teach a lexicon of caring, of nurturing, of peace, of non-aggression. That seems to be a little bit harder for us to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Joyce. We'll now hear from Patricia McCormick, who is the author of 3 critically acclaimed novels: Sold, an account of sexual trafficking; My Brother's Keeper, a view of teenage substance abuse; and Cut, an intimate portrait of a teenager's struggle with self-injury. And she also recently returned from Cambodia, where she interviewed survivors of the genocide there and also talked with former Khmer Rouge soldiers. Patricia McCormick.
Well, I'm not at all an expert on genocide. If anything, you can tell from my resume there that I'm a generalist. But my contribution, I think, to today's conversation is this recent trip that I took. And I have to say that I haven't really fully processed everything from this trip only 2.5 weeks ago. My purpose there was to spend a lot of time with one survivor in particular, a man who's now 44, but who at age 11 was separated from his family and put in a work camp, and then later survived by playing music to entertain the Khmer Rouge officials and to cover up the sounds of the killings at the death camp. He is a very unusual person. He returned to Cambodia later in life and found the few remaining master musicians. 90% of the artists were killed during Pol Pot's reign. And he found the remaining musicians and got them stipends and musical instruments, and they are now teaching the traditional music that would have been lost. They're teaching that music to the next generation of children. He's unusual too because when he was in this death camp, he became sort of a secret Samaritan. He stole rice for the other children. He snuck one little boy out of his place in line to be exterminated. He flirted with the Khmer Rouge teenage cadre, the girls, to get favors for the music teacher that he loved so much. And he befriended this one soldier who was also young. He was an 18-year-old young man who was an orphan, and and I interviewed him. He's still Khmer Rouge, and he's still a true believer, and he still does not understand why the world vilifies the Khmer Rouge and why there's a trial going on right now. But he also had deep reserves of kindness and generosity and courage for this other young man. But I guess what we're here to talk about is not what makes one person a hero in a circumstance like this, but what allows so many people to be so cruel. And my focus is on the young people of the Cambodian genocide, the teenagers. And they were interesting in part because their identities were not yet formed. They were in a very pliable state as far as forging an identity. They were taken from their parents. They were very naive, many of them illiterate peasants, and in a very isolated situation. So they were indoctrinated to hate each other and lived in an atmosphere of paranoia where every day there would be meetings at the death camp, and you would have to state the mistakes that you made today, and then you would have to report on those around you. So you couldn't trust anybody, and you were rewarded for ratting on each other. And you also were not allowed to show any emotion. And so humanity itself became a crime. That if you were to show your feelings or to take action upon the violence that you saw, that would be cause for your own death. So you unlearn your humanity in those circumstances. So I think I'll stop there.
Okay. Next we're going to hear from Henri Parens, who is a survivor of the Holocaust and a professor of psychiatry at Jefferson Medical College. He's the author of 200 scientific and other papers and of 8 books, including Dependence in Man, The Development of Aggression in Early Childhood, and Aggression in Our Children, and another book, Renewal of Life, Healing from the Holocaust. Henri Parens.
Well, I was fine when I came here. But after seeing that, I am a witness to the fact that if you've lived in a Holocaust, all the Holocausts bring the same byproduct, the same pain and distress. And those young people made me think very much of myself and those around us. I was 11, I was 12 too. I was 12 when I escaped from a concentration camp. I've studied mother-child interactions in fact, we did a 37-year follow-up study recently. And I want to just mention to you a couple things from that. We've studied, among the things that we've found, and by the way, I want you to know that my Holocaust experience has determined all of my research work, from the development of aggression in early childhood to helping mothers be better mothers. By the way, my mother was killed in Auschwitz, and so was the rest of my family. And from there, I went to the prevention of violence, and I'm ending up now in a prevention of malignant prejudice. And I wanted to show you 2 slides about prejudice. Let me explain them, because I think that there may be some disconnect between this computer and
I think
my
what's
PowerPoint.
You've got a
A newer
format,
PowerPoint. Yeah,
and we don't
right.
have that
Okay.
on this computer. So I'm sorry, I apologize.
The first thing that I want to say very quickly is that we all have prejudices. And I was shocked because when I discovered that in my own studies, given that I objected to that assumption that we all have prejudices. But then, knowing something about child development, in my field, that is in psychoanalysis and psychiatry, I came to realize that there are 2 critical factors that operate in us that are obligatory for healthy development that make us all have prejudices. The first one is that in the process of attaching to objects, infants come into the world ready to attach, but not attached. In the process of attaching, there are certain reactions they have, one of which is stranger anxiety, which was described by Spitz. Now, stranger anxiety is in the service of protecting the child's attachment to its own specific mother and father, because the attachment process is sort of indiscriminate, and an infant will attach just to anyone were it not for this built-in process of self-determination and object determination, that is, determination of the other. The second, so that stranger anxiety is obligatory for normal attachment, and there's no way that we can prevent normal prejudice, because if we were to try to interfere with that, we would be interfering with normal attachment. The second thing is, as Freud pointed out, identification. And that is, as Freud pointed out, we all bear the stamp made, he said, in Germany, but I would say in the Nercessian home, in a Kiernan home, in the Parens home, we all bear the stamp of our family, our community, and we do this by the process of identification. So between stranger anxiety and identification, both of which are highly desirable, not only for attachment, but even for community formation, because we must identify with the members of our community in order to maintain the integrity of that community. You know, thinking teleologically, one can do that. And that's okay, one can criticize that. Given that we all have benign, what I call benign prejudices, then the question is, what's that other stuff that we all are so troubled by and so concerned about? And two factors operate to modify or to transform our benign prejudice into what I'm calling malignant prejudice. And those two factors are the degree to which we are made to feel hostility, because that hostility will invade, if you will, or color our benign prejudice, and will await any target to be discharged. See, if I had this slide, I could show a little bit about aggression. In studying aggression in children, I found that Freud's wonderful theory of aggression really didn't hold up. And as a result, I had to conceptualize a new model to work with aggression, and I discovered one factor that is pertinent to what I'm saying, and that is that it is excessive unpleasure that generates hostility in all of us. Right now, you all like me, I'm a nice guy, but if I start spitting at you and insulting you, you're going to have different feelings toward me, and they will be because I have injured your narcissism. So any source of excessive unpleasure generates hostility in human beings. Now, if you consider how many children are traumatized at home, and by the way, you all know that the greatest degree of traumatization, in spite of these genocides, the greatest degree of traumatization occurs at home, in the community, right? I mean, all we need to do is to walk the streets of New York or Philadelphia or anywhere, right? So the one thing that transforms the benign prejudice into malignant prejudice is the degree to which we have been traumatized and we have accumulated hostility within us, which then colors the benign prejudice and transforms it. So excessive hostility in all of us is a big culprit. The second one is the great dishonor of civilization, and that is militant education. A dear friend of mine who read my Holocaust memoirs, who happens to have been from Hamburg, he died very recently, when he read my memoirs, wrote to me a several-page letter in which he said, you know, when I was a kid, I didn't know any Jews, but I hated the Jews because I was taught that the Jews had killed Christ, and I was taught to hate the Jews. Education in the service of this kind of transmission of information and knowledge is a major contributor to malignant prejudice. Obviously, if we want to do something about genocides, I think we have to raise the question, how do we modify these things? The traumatization of children, and malignant education. Right.
Okay, thank you, Henri. From the point of view of a historian who's interested in documenting human rights violations, as we would call them now, I think one of the most important starting points is to identify the phenomenon, to define the phenomenon that we're talking about, in this case, aggression and genocide. And the definition I'm quite happy with, I guess it's something like the legal definition of aggression is an unprovoked attack, although we do hear words like war of choice and other words that could be used to describe the same thing. But there may be many other definitions of aggression in different disciplines, and in a minute I'd like to throw the discussion open to an interdisciplinary discussion around the table of these definitions. Genocide is much more difficult, perhaps, to define, and the legal definition there, as many of you will probably know, is that it's defined by the Genocide Convention of 1948 as acts committed with the intent to destroy in whole or in part an ethnic, national, racial or religious group as such. And those acts are acts such as killing members of the group, or imposing physical or mental harm on the group, or creating conditions of life calculated to destroy the group in whole or in part, or removing children of the group to another group. So that's the legal definition of genocide. Helen Fine, as a sociologist, came up with a slightly different one that wasn't restricted to ethnic, national, racial or religious groups, but includes political or social groups. And so that's a different, more scholarly, perhaps almost more sociological definition of genocide, which does not just cover ethnic or national or racial or religious groups. There is also a definition which other scholars have come up with that defines genocide as any group that's targeted by the perpetrator. In other words, that the group doesn't have to have a real existence. It could be an invented or imaginary group. That's not Helen Fine's definition, that's the definition of Frank Chalk and Kurt Jonasson. So these are some of the definitions of genocide, but they usually revolve around intentional destruction of groups. Now, if we can use that definition, focusing perhaps on racial or religious hatred, we can more easily identify what phenomena or catastrophes we want to describe as genocide, and others differently, say unintentional destruction. From the historian's point of view, what are the causes of genocide? What are the reasons why this phenomenon happens? It's a very important issue, and I'd also like to get some interdisciplinary feedback on that particular issue. From a historical point of view, you could say there are the immediate individual causes of genocide, the sorts of causes that motivate a genocide perpetrator to order the destruction of a group. And what is it that causes that? Well, obviously racial or religious hatred is one of the sort of essential, at least according to the legal definition, essential features or causes of the motivation of a genocide perpetrator. There are other causes that are more long-term, that enable a genocide perpetrator or groups, a genocidal insurgency or regime, to come to power and carry out those ideas of destruction of a group. And they are not necessarily immediate causes, they are usually much longer term. And here I'm talking about war, ethnic destabilization or economic destabilization, poverty or political upheaval. All of those tumultuous events in a society make it more likely that extremist, violent groups who have these ideas that are the immediate causes of genocide can recruit followers and come to power and carry them out. And perhaps we need to distinguish between these long-term historical, or you might call them social, causes of genocide, and then the immediate causes, what motivates the decision to go ahead with genocide. Now, there are some very important issues that Joyce also raised, and the issue of war and peace is one of them. In my view, most of the cases of genocide in history have been accompanied by war, that maybe even facilitated by war. And it's easier for genocidal perpetrators to recruit followers in wartime conditions. They have the excuse of emergency activity, emergency urgent need to take drastic action in wartime. They also have the cover of war, where they can blanket the news media and carry out violent criminal schemes without being reported. So I think it's very important to think about these longer term social or historical phenomena that enable genocide. You might not necessarily call them genocide. Also, you might not necessarily call them the causes of genocide. And that the same for the immediate or the individual perpetrator's mindset. Racial and religious hatred is essential, but I believe there are some other, not necessarily causes, but possibly associated features of the genocidal mindset that may not explain why it happens, or they may, but these features also help us identify it in advance as it's coming. The perpetrators are often talking to one another, or writing diaries, or leaving minutes of their meetings, or broadcasting on radios, saying what they're going to do. And they talk about racial and religious hatred quite a lot, and that gives them away as possible genocide perpetrators. But the associated features of that mindset are, I think, territorial expansionism, which often requires war. And many, many cases of genocide have been accompanied by the violent aggression of territorial conquest. And what is to be done with that land that is conquered? Often the agrarian romantic is found in the mind of the perpetrator as well. The idea that the land is not being used by the people who are going to be conquered, who it's going to be taken from, and that it can be put to better use by the preferred ethnic group, and that the people who have the land now don't deserve it because they are not farmers or they're not cultivators. And often this gets into the targeting of urban groups or pastoral groups or hunter-gatherer groups, whether Native Americans or Australian Aborigines or urban populations or landless populations like Jews or Gypsies. And along with that is another feature of the genocidal mindset, the cult of antiquity, the concept of a past glory that's been lost by the perpetrator's ethnic group. And this comes up obviously with the many genocidal regimes, from the Nazis to the Hutu power regime, the idea that a pristine agrarian society once existed and it was extended over more territory than it currently does, and that territory needs to be reconquered, and the people who live there need to be expelled or killed, and the land put to better use, so that those features of racialism and agrarianism and expansionism and a sense of a pristine past often go together in the genocidal mindset, and they can inform us, if we're watching these groups before they come to power, with a sense of these are the groups to watch. But not necessarily are these causes, but they're perhaps associated features of genocide. So I'd like to invite the other panelists to talk about the definitions of genocide that may apply in their particular discipline or occupation, and the causation factors. Maybe we could start with Joyce and move around the table.
One of the things that I think Ben really referred to is something we don't like to think about, and that is the utilitarian nature of genocide, and that in some ways genocide is rational and is effective. That some people gain territory, they have incentives. That there is a politics of genocide that's part of that rationality. And this is, of course, counter to that mythos of, oh, they all went crazy. And that's something that's difficult for us to accept.
Are there successful genocides?
It depends what you mean by success. In Darfur, for example, in Western Sudan, the demography has been transformed. People who 2.5 million people have become displaced. Other people have moved in. This is not an unusual occurrence. So booty, looting, burning, acquiring cattle, that there are, I think it goes back to sort of the utilitarian nature of both land, which you argue in your book is such an important feature of genocide. War and genocides are intimately connected with one another.
Taylor, would you like to come in there?
Sure. I think the sort of the seeds of genocide that which you've laid out, happening during times of war, all of that applies to Rwanda as well. Rwanda we can look back in history and find that the first instance of political violence actually happened in 1959 in Rwanda with the Hutu Revolution, and over the course of time. But in 1990, the RPF invaded the country, and for the 4 years that led up to the genocide, this was a time of war. You also mentioned economic destabilization, with coffee prices bottoming out and the majority population, who were farmers, becoming even more poor, and political upheaval. Ultimately, when the president's plane was shot down on April 6, 1994, this created a vacuum which allowed the Hutu extremist party to fill that void. So every sort of category that you've stated fits perfectly with the Rwandan genocide, as well as the cult of antiquity. I think what we're not looking at, some questions, how do societies end up turning on themselves, things like that, with little detailed stories that we find in narratives. For example, a story about a mother lining up her own children and looking at her children and saying, these two resemble mostly, the father, the Tutsi father, but these two, no. So I'm going to kill my own children. Now, these things were happening in Rwanda. And that is perhaps, somehow disconnected from these larger things happening, war and political upheaval, and also connected. But what leads even a mother to kill her own husband and her own children? Is it simply fear of regime? Those are other questions that I would raise in the conversation.
Okay.
That's a good question for you.
Yes, I do think that, and as an analyst, all of the things that you're saying, really make a great deal of sense, and I found that to be the case too. Thinking of for me, the prototypic genocide, what happened in the Holocaust, all the economic destabilization, the need for, more room, because Germany is, after all, a encircled country, if you will, and space is limited, and every acre of ground is used. For those of you who've been to Germany can attest to that. But I'm still left with the question, and it's interesting that you were getting to the family, the mother, with the kids. We have 3 sons, my wife and I, and I recall during their growing up, that they would have fights with each other. Quite unavoidably, siblings have arguments with each other. One steps in the other's room, or one steps on the other's thing. But it was very interesting that when they became teenagers and they began to really, their cognitive functioning really began to evolve, we had these marvelous discussions at the table. And so here the guys would be talking about the atom bomb and, what can be done about that. And the next thing you knew, they had a fight. And so I used to say to them, wise guy that I am, if you two guys can't get along, how do you expect neighboring countries to get along? They weren't very happy with me when I would say that, because unfortunately they recognized some element of psychological fact in that. And I think I'm looking for the underlying common denominator of excessive unpleasure. That is, of excessive emotional pain, excessive psychic pain, breaks down in the economy. And by the way, we are in an era that has one of the parameters for the activation of a genocide. I think we need to be aware of that. And the universal community, and now of course, is much more aware of these things, which is very good for all of us. But life's tough. And no matter how good one's life is, there is pain. And the question is, how can we help our kids grow to tolerate pain more reasonably, and to not visit their distress and their complaints onto other people. And I think that for that reason, I'm pushing parenting education, because there's a great deal that parents can learn that would really obviate the development of excessive hostility within their own children. We analysts know that you are subjected to some psychic pain and you accumulate hostility toward that individual. Well, now, if that individual is bigger than you are, you're obviously not going to lash out at that person. You're going to wait for somebody who's going to come around and make herself or himself a target for your accumulated hostility. And think of it, if you're angry with your own mother and your own father, like Hitler was, particularly with his unknown father, Stalin, a guy by the name of Turner, wrote a book on Stalin, historian. Robert Turner?
Tucker.
Tucker, there you go. Thank you, Robert Tucker. He tells us that Stalin, seeing his father beat his mother all the time. When he was 16, according to Tucker, confronted his father when he was about to hit his mother and said to him, "You hit her one more time and I'm going to kill you." Well, of course, Stalin didn't kill his father. He only killed 50 million other people. Right? So,
Patricia, I wonder if the Khmer Rouge whom you interviewed had a concept of what he had done, what his regime had done. Did he have a name for it? If it was justifiable, what did he call it? And also, what did he think was the cause of it? Or maybe the witnesses or the victims that you interviewed had a view about the phenomenon, how it could be named or defined, and what caused it.
That's a great question. All the features that you described were present at the Khmer Rouge reign. The economic deprivation, the sense of former glory, etc. The thing that I think struck me about the man that I interviewed in depth was the culture of violence that he experienced as a child, and that he was orphaned and he lived along the border with Vietnam, where our government did its most hideous secret bombing of this country. And so I remember one of the things he said to me was, "I saw the Americans drop gasoline," by which I think he means napalm, and he said, "I saw them fry the people," or grill the people was his word. And so if that was his formative experience, it isn't much of a leap to think of him becoming a perpetrator. What does he call what happened? It's so interesting, the euphemisms and the vagueness that you get, or that I received when I tried to go directly at a question like that. Everybody would kind of take these crazy turns, and they would blame others. They found a whole nother set of outsiders upon whom to blame these deaths, and said that they were rumored in the same way that Holocaust deniers do, which is something I can't understand. But he now lives in a situation of such isolation. He's living in a part of the country where it's all Khmer Rouge, or all former Khmer Rouge. And so they just reinforce this notion with each other that they are the aggrieved party, and that these trials are a farce and an injustice.
What about the victims? Did they have a sense of what caused it?
Again, it's a very interesting experience to interview people and try to put those questions in a direct way. My experience was that people in Cambodia, at least, are not as comfortable talking about those experiences as you might expect, that they don't get a catharsis from revealing those really painful things and having them witnessed. That retelling, they're very reluctant to retell. They have taken on an enormous amount of shame and blame still for what happened. And so they don't want to tell their stories. They consider it shameful for others to propagate the telling of the stories. And they don't want to talk about unpleasant things in groups either. That it's one thing to talk about it privately, but can't share that information with groups.
I can share one example from Cambodia that a Swedish journalist told me many years ago, that he'd interviewed a young boy whose village had been bombed in 1969, I think, and he had fled into the jungle. A large proportion of the village population had been killed, and he went straight into a Khmer Rouge patrol. They were a small insurgency. They gave him a gun and they told him that the killing birds, the planes, bombers, had come from Phnom Penh, which was a total lie. They had not.
Right.
And he became a Khmer Rouge soldier, and he was talking 1979 after the fall of the regime on the Thai border to this Swedish journalist, and he had killed 200 people. And the journalist said, "What does it feel like to kill so many people?" And he said, "It hurts here." I'm not sure how you explain that. Maybe we need to be talking about solutions rather than explanations next.
Please. Let's talk about solutions.
So,
For
Taylor,
example,
yeah.
one thing.
No, I just wanted to comment basically about some of the things that you've talked about, the two of you, in terms of growing up and seeing violences enacted, and perhaps then that creating a perpetrator, some sort of psychic pain or trauma. I would pose the question then, do you expect then Holocaust survivors or survivors of the Rwandan genocide to then become aggressors themselves? And I think we're in dangerous territory here if we begin that conversation.
But that's exactly where I want to go.
Danger ahead.
That's exactly where I want to go.
Because I think we don't see survivors of the Rwandan genocide as going out and killing their neighbors. They are simply trying to move on with their lives.
That's correct.
And they are not aggressors themselves.
That's correct.
And,
So how do
and
we
this
make
whole
that?
idea is perverted when people talk about forgiveness and reconciliation. So I
Right.
think that's an important conversation. to
Absolutely.
raise.
And, you know, when you stated the word aggrieved, all right, the aggrieved party, and that is a locus for intervention. Namely, for example, in India, my friend Salman Akhtar, who's from India, tells me that they're not genocides, but the crimes of the Hindus against the Muslims are a back and forth phenomenon. And so that the aggrieved party, and this is part of tradition, part of what is transmitted, it's these people who did this to our ancestors, and you, if you're going to be a good, whatever it is, you're going to have to go and want to kill the others. And the issue of the aggrieved party being burdened with the community dictum that you must avenge your particular community is one locus where things can be done. And that, of course, that's one of the things that the UN is trying to do.
Well,
So education,
Not all that successfully, but
reconciliation and education.
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And some of the efforts that are being made, for example, between the Palestinians and Israelis, is really marvelous. And in spite of the fact that the Second Intifada has not been going on and has evolved, still there are many Palestinians and Israelis who have worked together for coexistence. And, some people are concerned that, well, but now that the Intifada has occurred, isn't it likely that their original conciliatory efforts have vanished? And as a psychoanalyst, I have to say no. Because once the ego, as we say, learns something, even though time may pass and that thing may be forgotten, when a stimulus for its remembering occurs, it really comes back very easily. Think of a language that you haven't spoken for a long time, that you've learned.
Joyce, I wonder, as an educationalist, if you could enlighten us on what kind of education can make it more likely that people will refuse to participate in genocide.
I think one of the interesting things I think we sort of need to raise also, that there's a politics of genocide, that some events we call genocide and others we don't.
Yeah.
Who decides what is called genocide and why? The actual genocide going on right now in Darfur, is it the only one? Why is it the one being focused on? why other kinds of atrocities aren't. So these are really important, I think, questions to look at. So how are we educating people in terms of which events do we record and how do we record them? One person's genocide or terror is another's liberation, of course.
Right.
So
Right.
so this is a very difficult and political movement. As far as education is concerned, I think one of the things that's clear is that just teaching about atrocity, and which is which is what students tend to be and our society tends to be interested in, doesn't seem to be that effective. And that's something we might want to think about, because we just saw these terrible, wrenching testimonies. I had mentioned, what about looking at and educating about a different type of language? I always like to tell the story of teaching a course at the New School University to 25 undergraduates who chose it as an elective, and it was called Cultures of Peace and Reconciliation. And the first day I asked them they were 18 to 22 years old, and I asked them what the term altruism meant. Not one knew. So one of our issues, again, and I think I said this in my opening comments, is that education is educare, to lead out, and to rethink. We can't not acknowledge aggression, conflict, war, genocide, and we do have a wonderful lexicon of terms and scholarly debates on this. But the issue of people learning about cooperation, about social justice, about community building is something that's more difficult to do. And all I can tell you is, if I offer a course on comparative genocide, I fill. And when I offer a course on peace and justice, sounds too soft, and I don't fill up.
Can I just pursue that by asking, do you think it's counterproductive to talk about some genocides while obscuring some others, even that are going on right now? For instance, I wonder if it's important to talk about the current dispossession and destruction of native groups in Brazil right now, or the other parts of the Amazon. We don't hear much about that at all.
No.
Although the death toll in Darfur is much greater. It could be, would there be an educational rationale for being more inclusive, or is it indeed counterproductive to be more exclusive?
I agree with you. Actually, every year, every course, I say to students, I just want to say what's left out of this syllabus. I have selected certain things based on readings on what's available. If I teach in Norway, I'm going to talk, which I did a couple of years ago, I talked about Norway during the Holocaust, during World War II. When I teach in the United States, I ask the question if the destruction of indigenous peoples of America and of slavery is or isn't genocide. It seems to me that as teachers, you have to place and look at these events. So it's very complicated.
But that doesn't intimidate us, does it?
No,
That's
it doesn't.
very
It doesn't intimidate. But what it does is, if there's a kind of resistance that you're doing, resistance education, in saying, no, it's not simple. No, it wasn't just Hitler. No, it wasn't just Stalin. No, the great man evil theories of history. No, it wasn't just Saddam Hussein. Those have gotten it in. That's too simple. And no, it's not just this group, and it's not just that group. So it's very complicated and complex, and it isn't just others. It's ordinary people who could be us.
May I ask a question? It seems to me what you were talking about and feeling optimistic about, unless I misunderstood you, that somehow education can change this?
Oh, education makes a great contribution. And if education makes a great contribution toward genocide, then education can make a great contribution against genocide. I think that education is the most powerful thing that we have to guide our children and guide ourselves. I think that I lay it at the feet of educators who have taught a prejudice, that they have to unteach prejudice. And so, yes, education is a very powerful tool.
Let's take up that gauntlet then and think about what the goals of genocide education or education that counters aggression would be. Obviously, to refuse to participate in genocide is a good outcome of a genocide. What about of genocide education? What about rescue? That's a more positive thing than refusing. We saw the video of the very moving story of the Jehovah's Witnesses who were Hutus who hid a Tutsi family and protected them. What is it that makes people rescue others in conditions of genocide? Or just refuse to participate, but that seems to me to be a different thing. Or not rescue. What are the causes of that? That's something we could look at, and maybe you'd like to chime in there. Yeah.
Well, if you put it that way. I think, this question of education, what makes a rescuer, what makes, this is almost assuming that the default is to be a killer. In a place like Rwanda, if you look at education, yes, what led up to the genocide, you had students who were made to stand up if they were Tutsi and sit down, and so even in the educational atmosphere, you did have this ideology of otherness that was being created, that the Tutsi were foreigners that invaded the country. Education that takes place within a country when everything breaks down is one thing, because when genocide occurs, it's under the context of things breaking down. Education that happens internationally has a different effect, whether it is preventative or leading towards intervention. International education has something very different. I think it's important to note that what you just watched were simply segments from testimonies and not actually representative of what an educational curriculum could include. An educational curriculum that would include a life story of an individual talking about her life as a child growing up, beautiful stories of her going to the lake and swimming and being with her relatives and families that later on you understand that she has lost, and you understand the meaning of loss, that in fact she becomes a real human being. So to us in this country, when we read in the newspaper about ancient tribal violence in Rwanda in 1994, which is what we were reading in our media, that we understand actually that these are human beings, not barbarians. The otherness also plays a role in our lack of intervention, our lack of prevention. So I wouldn't necessarily focus on something like narratives of rescuers and what made a rescuer important. I think, in fact, that shifts the focus away in some regard.
And I think Ed's point is a good one, too, about what makes someone not be a rescuer or what makes someone collude in the cruelty or participate in it.
Including countries.
Yeah, that's true.
I think, again, the politics of genocide is very complex. This great advocacy movement many of my students have been a part of, Save Darfur or Stand, I think it's very admirable in many ways. But of course, it displaced students really being engaged in violence in Afghanistan or Iraq on the part of the U.S. or other places where atrocities are going on. So again, who chooses, how they choose, what to become involved in, what to become educated in. And also, I think it's really important that none of us really have the high moral ground. And that, that discourse is very important. I look around and look at faces of people here, the color of people here, the age of people here, who isn't here, why aren't they, and issues of class, etc. So we're all kind of humbled by understanding that in a way it's a privilege to have this dialogue. Many people who have been part of genocides, of course, don't have that privilege.
And that so much of our focus is and should be on the victims, but I think it's fascinating and important to understand the perpetrators as well. I'm really not going to try to stand up for them here.
Yes.
But one of the things that was remarkable in Cambodia, and this is probably the case in Rwanda as well, the Documentation Center of Cambodia, these are the folks who pulled together all the information that led to the tribunals now where the top 5 Khmer Rouge officials are on trial. Okay. They have also spent time interviewing about 10,000 Khmer Rouge to collect their stories too and to try to understand how they were brought into the movement and how they understand what they did during that period. And two of the questions that they ask are these. One is, did you ever do anything to save someone else? Because they tend to take on, just like the victims take on their shame, it seems as though the perpetrators in this country take on this blanket indictment of everything that Pol Pot did. They are also equally responsible for. And there are these incredible stories of kindness and heroism. Did you ever save anyone? Did you ever stop anybody from torturing another person? And suddenly these people are able to recall moments of humanity and see themselves in more nuanced terms. And this is really important, I think, because they're living next door to the people that they traumatized now. Some 25, 30 years after, they're all reintegrated. And I think that's the case in Rwanda, too, that neighbor reported on neighbor and neighbor killed neighbor, and now they're back living together. And Cambodia is a country, the entire country has PTSD. Everybody over 35 was in some way affected by this genocide, and so they are all victims.
Too many thoughts, too many. Too many.
Benedict, can I just
Sure.
Patty brings up an interesting point about the perpetrators in a certain way, and when I've been a long time patient in psychoanalysis, so and that brought me to doing what I'm doing now to some extent. And my analyst had introduced political theory as metaphors for intrapsychic states. So we used to talk about irredentism as the propensity of formerly Balkanized countries to reconstitute themselves and how that affected how one understanding of personality. But another one is displacement, for instance. Like for instance, if I have an insoluble problem, and that's I'm sort of talking to your point. My tendency is to want to not deal with the problem itself, but to externalize that problem. And so when you talk about education, there's another force under. I'm all for education, and obviously we wouldn't be trying to do affirmative activities in human existence if there weren't possibilities. But there are these drives in the human species, and one of them is the drive to escape those things which are insoluble, and to try to we have Weimar Germany, and we have the huge inflation, we have the problem. You yourself said it. In a way, genocide is a solution. In certain kinds of insoluble.
I'd just like to raise one more question about the prevention of genocide rather than the explanation of it, and not just focusing on those who refuse to participate or those who rescue others, but what about those who resist and inflict casualties on the perpetrators? They have to be, in many cases, in fact, they have been part of the solution in overthrowing the regime, even groups that have committed human rights violations, a bit like the Khmer Rouge that you mentioned, but they have actually participated in ending a genocide. Now, I wanted to ask Henri whether the issue of aggression that applies in committing genocide is the same phenomenon that motivates someone to stand up and oppose it and fight against it? Or are we talking about a different phenomenon?
We're talking about a different aggression, and that's one of the things that I came to really insist on in terms of the work that we saw. There is aggression that is non-destructive, and that's my concern about the use of the word aggression here, because we're really talking about hostility and hate, and that's different. I'm sorry that I can't work my model here. I would show you what I'm talking about. But no, I think that there is there is aggression that is healthy. I think that serves adaptation, and that could be what is serving those who need to protect and need to fight against the destruction of others. The hostility and hate really arises, I believe, from mostly intrapsychic pain that becomes expressed, that can be harnessed. There are many, when Hitler did what he did, there are zillions of followers, right? Well, they themselves would not have acted that way. But given a leader who can mobilize that hostility that is accumulated in them, you can get an army of people. You know, the old song, give me 10 men who are stout-hearted men, and I'll soon give you 10,000 more, something like that. Yeah. But the one thing I did want to say, too, is a point that you were making, and that is the story of the perpetrators And I think that in the genocides, I think it's important to get the experience of the perpetrators, get them to verbalize some of the things that they experienced. Because if what has been found in the Holocaust model applies to the model of other genocides, then there is a critical factor that can be brought to play in prevention. Mm-hmm. For example, Dan Baron from Israel has done a great deal of work in interviewing the children of survivors with the children of perpetrators. And what's come out of that is fascinating. As one of the children of perpetrators said to another in rage, you know, you've suffered, but you have your pride. I have suffered, and I live with shame.
Wow.
Now, I've written a paper on that if we can harness the awareness of the shame that perpetrators yield to their children and the generation after, that could be a deterrent. I don't know. But I think we've got to try everything.
I think we've got some time for questions now. We could ask people to direct their question. Identify yourself, name and occupation, and direct your question to one member of the panel specifically.
I'm Philo Tom, and Henri and I know each other. We've participated in Salt Lake City in a conference on prejudice and aggression and the related issues. And we are both survivors of World War II and the Holocaust. I want to ask the panel and also the audience to think about an escalation of murder, from individual murder to gang murder to mass murder to massacre and then to genocide, because I think there is a difference. On the other hand, there is also a big difference about the whole idea of killing. Side in the word genocide means to kill. So why isn't the death of the soldiers in the playing fields of Stalingrad on both sides called genocide, where large numbers of people were exterminated? So we have to make a distinction between the murder sanctified as warfare and genocide on defenseless civilians,
Right.
no matter who does it.
Right.
And I think in the world we're living today, especially with the current financial crisis, we have to think of the tendency to think of war as a solution to economic problems, which is exactly what Hitler purported to do after the situation in Weimar. And then as one of the contributors said here, you can say that Germany engaged in very successful genocide because they became a very affluent nation after World War II. But don't forget the Marshall Plan. If it weren't for the Marshall Plan, and with the Morgenthau Plan in place, it would have been a different situation. So, having said this, let me say that the clearest example of genocide that I can think of is the Shoah, where a defenseless population was systematically exterminated with the most modern ways of killing people and disposing of them. And here, what I think also enters with the genocide is what I'd like to call a culture side. The Nazis were out to destroy not only the Jewish people as people, but also to destroy their culture. And this is a very different thing. This is more like the Inquisition or dealing with infidels. And I think this is also a recent issue because the confrontation between Islam and Christianity, or the West and the East, in today's terms, is a clash of cultures and ideology. So the issue of prejudice becomes very importantly tied to ideology and murdering others for the sake of an idea.
Joyce, would you like to go?
I thought maybe we'd put
Get a
a
few
few
questions.
questions,
Yeah, we'll
yeah.
get a few
Oh, good
questions
idea.
together. Right.
I think it's my turn.
Yes,
Yes.
sure.
Left, right. My name is Larry Cutler. Do you think there is a general tendency for genocide and war to grow I'm your historian. And do you think that the education of students will really determine how the masses, or whoever, as was said, will accept a anti-aggression policy if they are when the educators are those who run society? In other words, and where? Because I believe that genocide or some form of will grow, and where will it grow? And I don't only see it in terms of Africa or what happened in Cambodia, but where else? Since you're somewhat political too, where else is the possibilities of genocide growing with all these wars and all this inter-imperialist rivalry increasing as the United States gets weaker? Where will these things happen?
Okay, two more questions, and then we'll refer to the panel.
I want to introduce myself in a complicated way. I'll be giving a paper in Boston and in July, and then again in August in Rome, and then again here sometime in 2010 on genocide. So I'm going to speak in part from the paper, then working from, and talk about the biases that I heard in the room.
Who are you?
My name is Ben Roth. I'm also an analyst, and I'm a group analyst. And the presentations are about group theory. And I want to make a couple of points that the opposite of malignant in term is not benign. And you use that term, Henri. We don't have a really good term for the opposite of malignant. And I was really impressed that the psychoanalytic community continues its preoccupation with the victims. And although moved by the presentation, I don't believe that we're going to understand genocide by studying victims. And because of the identification that most of the analysts are Jewish, have come from a European background, there is this consistent preoccupation with suffering and identification with the victims, which is also part of medicine, I believe. So that when I came here, although moved by the examples here, I also thought of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, in which I watched the granting of pardons to people who had committed atrocities, who were then allowed to come forward and talk about them in large audiences. But my point is that even in the definition of group, which you quoted definition of genocide, which you quoted accurately, it constantly refers to group action. It is not the wiping out of an individual. It's the wiping out of a group. And Lemkin, in his definitions, clearly referred to group behavior. And yet there is an individual bias in looking at the genocide to either look at Hitler, Stalin, and other great individuals, Eichmann, who I'm studying now. I'm trying to get his Rorschach test. I've gotten the Rorschach test, or be studying the Rorschach test of most of the people who were tried at Nuremberg. But it tells me about them as individuals and doesn't tell me about them and how they behaved in groups.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Sue Shapiro, and in some ways I think the issues that I'm thinking of and the points that I want to make have preoccupied me since I was a child growing up, right post-Holocaust, going to yeshiva, and I can't remember a time that I didn't ask myself, would I have survived, and would I have hidden people? And I think it's so much easier, as a number of people have said, to identify with the victim, and I think it's been important to hear individual stories because we can't conceptualize, we can't conceive of 1 million people or 6 million people. But I think it's equally important, and more so perhaps, to really allow ourselves to think about the perpetrator and to recognize that all of us, or many of us, under certain circumstances, could become savage and violent. And it's not just, there's the kind of killing that is getting increasingly easy with robots, and P.W. Singer has been writing about where, we run Iraq, we do that war from Colorado or something, and so you're completely disconnected from killing. That's one thing. And then the other is the kind of permission for sadism, and that then unleashes a side of ourselves that is very scary to recognize. And I think we have to do that if we're going to really address this, that it's not just awful, crazy people who do this. Now, I think, too, that the issue of education, the research that was done, I know Irving Staub, I think, did work after, both with Kitty Genovese and trying to figure out what made people stand by and do nothing, what would allow people or increase the likelihood of getting involved, and what contributes to altruism. I think about teaching kids nonviolent communication and mediation skills. And, if this is, we talk about aggression, okay, that we're all, it's an instinct or whatever, but we do lots of things to counteract or to work with instincts. And if it means working harder, we have to work harder around that stuff. I think of just, instead of teaching kids to play dodgeball, I couldn't figure out ever, what was the point of that? You throw the ball and hit the person as hard as you can. Now, that's not even just competing with skills. And so if we're going to do that in the schools, why don't we use our imagination and find ways of making nonviolent communication as sexy as dodgeball?
Sex will do it.
One more question, and then we'll turn it over to the panelists.
My name is Vivian Bauer. I'm an artist, and when you said that when you have classes about genocide, the class gets filled, and I am just an ordinary person. And when the Rwandan genocide was going on, and the media was filled with these gruesome images, I left the work I'd been doing, and for 2.5 years, I did work on the Rwandan genocide. And I think that my inquiry, I don't think I really ever have completely understood. That's why I'm here, wanting to hear more. Why was I so driven to collect images and every day to go in my studio and to work with these images? And I don't have an answer. I'm still inquiring. But I think that there is something about the recognition in oneself, which I think is probably what's in here, the recognition myself of a tendency toward violence, not that it manifests in any noticeable way, but it's in me. It's in me, and I think that's what compelled me to go toward these images. And I'm just wondering, I guess the question is, if there's a question, that can we really start with children very, very, very young to make them recognize that they're protecting some sense of self, a self that's endangered, the moment that there is something unfamiliar coming to that self? Do you think the children can really begin to learn that that self that they're protecting is the source of endless suffering?
Okay, we'll just go around the table.
Could I just take one thing up, because that, you see, I think that we're all still influenced. Freud did a lot of magnificent things. As far as I'm concerned, he's my greatest teacher. I've never had a better teacher than Freud. But he did make some mistakes. And one of them was the proposition that aggression in human beings is based on a death instinct with which we are all born. There is no way of proving a death instinct. There is no way of documenting that that really exists. And yet many people have made the assumption that there is an innate tendency in human beings to be violent. And I object to that. Let me give you an example of a biological phenomenon that was described by a French biologist in the 1800s. And his name was Roux, R-O-U-X. He was a physiologist, and he discovered, in working with unicellular organisms, that if he introduced a noxious agent within the cell, he saw a storm of reaction within the protoplasm. Why? In order to survive, the protoplasm was attempting, for the cell to survive, the protoplasm was attempting to rid itself of the noxious agent. And that's where I based my theory of the development of hostility. That's why I say excessive unpleasure is what generates hostility. I don't accept the notion that there is a tendency in human beings to be violent. There is a tendency to defend oneself. Now, if one has been abused and accumulates a great deal of hostility, one is going to look around to seek a target for that hostility that we've accumulated because we don't sit comfortably with it. Hostility within us.
Your son's fighting if there is no aggression.
Well, there is rivalry between. I didn't say there's no aggression.
But there's no hostility. What was causing your sons to fight?
Their rivalry. And their own possessions. One came into my. He came in my room and he used my.
Yeah, but that's just the surface level. It doesn't explain the underlying force that is making them fight.
No, I don't agree with you, my dear friend. Ed and I are dear friends, by the way. No, I think that it's a threat to one's possession. It's a threat. It's a narcissistic threat that generates, And by the way, a narcissistic threat is just one of the things that is experienced as excessively unpleasurable. So is excessive frustration. I'm naming several theories of aggression that have been named. Rockland's theory, Kohut's theory, the frustration-aggression hypothesis. Who's that? Oh, anyway, 1939. I'm sorry, my senior moment. In any case, no, I think that the tendency toward violence is something that I think we've inherited from the big mistake that Freud has made. And in his discussion with Einstein on why war, that was totally derailed, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, it's funny. I wanted to bring in why war because I think that was an opportunity that Freud completely poo-pooed. He said, I thought you were going to ask me a serious question. And, and instead of really taking Einstein's question seriously, how could we educate people so that there wouldn't be war? He didn't address that.
He did. I disagree with you. I believe he did. And what he said was that in order to give up, because he believed in the two instincts, that with civilization you tame the instincts, but if you keep taming them, because aggression and sexuality are so interconnected, you essentially will also be taming sexuality, and therefore there would be no possibility of propagation of the species.
You see, this is a wonderful example of how one flawed hypothesis leads to another flawed hypothesis.
I'd like to throw in a historical perspective in that just about every case of genocide that I was able to research, there was always the case that there were always people who were going to stand up and oppose it. It's not an ancient recurring human theme. It's something that's done by individuals or groups, but certain people who are perpetrators decide to do this. It doesn't mean that they're human, and many people oppose them from the start and pay the price. But many people who you wouldn't necessarily expect. I'll give you the example of the Young Turk regime who were perpetrating the Armenian genocide. A founding member of the Young Turks stood up in the Ottoman Parliament, Ahmed Reza his name was, and he denounced what was happening to the Armenians, and he actually put himself in the shoes of the Armenians by saying, grab me by the arm, steal my property, evict me from my village, as if he was an Armenian saying that. And then he said, this cannot go on. He said, neither Turkish culture nor the law will ever allow it, and the people who do this should be held accountable. And he said that while it was happening in the Senate of the Ottoman Empire. That's an extraordinarily brave thing to do by an authoritative figure in that movement. And there are many cases going back to Carthage where Cato kept saying the Carthaginians must be destroyed, and Scipio Nasca kept saying no, they should be allowed to stay left alone. Every time he said that, he provoked the riposte from Scipio. So,
But going back to Henry's point, there are many societies that don't seem to go by generally accepted accounting principles. That is to say that the impulse towards destruction is as an irrational economic and socioeconomic impulse. It seems to be. I mean, that's why I sort of disagree with you. Yugoslavia implodes and destroys itself in this war, which there can be no end to, and there's no one comes out from. And we have arms races that go on. I mean, there's so much proof of this kind of, that the Freudian proposition seems to be, to some way, not confuted by the realities of the continuing tendency to self-annihilate.
I think that's
Joyce?
too easy.
Freud.
Yeah. Good.
Freud
You don't have to
became a
defend Freud
sociological
with me.
thinker.
We know where we are. We know where we are, right? We're not in the AHA.
I defend Freud every day.
You can go next.
Freud became a sociological thinker in the essay of 1921, Group Psychology Analysis of the Ego.
Right.
And I think what Ross and I am trying to say is that it's a mistake to concentrate only on the psychology of the individual.
Correct.
You have to understand
Correct.
mass or mob activity. And this is why after Salt Lake, I wrote the paper, The Psychology of Mobs and Leaders.
Right.
What is it between a person like Hitler,
Right.
who was able to seduce the whole nation to go with him? And this book by Goldhagen was actually mistranslated in German. It was Hitler's willing executioners, which means henchmen. And in German it was translated Hitler and his followers. So it's really a shade of difference which tells the whole story.
Taylor is going to say something.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to me that there have been several respondents have asked that they hear the perpetrator's perspective to learn from, to listen to those narratives. And I think that's something that's very interesting. And perhaps Dr. Parens can even speak to what that urge to hear the perpetrator is, but that's a separate point. There's this question that I've just been handed that's come in from somebody watching on the internet, and it speaks to some of the things that you've just spoken about, perhaps about the difference between the impulse of the Hutu extremists, the elite, versus those who are actually committing the crimes on the ground. I believe it's important to study the phenomenon of genocide. This is from the internet. I believe it's important to study the phenomenon of genocide from both a top-down and bottom-up approach. Can the panelists speak about genocide education and awareness from the perspective of the individual versus the collective motivations driven by group psychology? I feel the power of the individual story is a particularly powerful approach to educating our public. I guess I'll start with that question. Obviously, I agree that the individual narrative is absolutely important to us, even getting in the framework to understand what we're dealing with, to hear things, to bring us back to an emotional place, to understand that these are human beings. And so the conversation does not turn into a conversation about theory, but rather based in reality. I think that many survivors, it's interesting in Rwanda, many survivors at the end of their testimonies, whether they be 8 hours or 10-hour-long life stories, end up saying, will you also record narratives of perpetrators? And yes, this is something that the organization feels is very valuable in terms of historic documentation, has even been preceded in the past, if we look at Claude Lanzmann's Shoah, that there are examples where narratives of perpetrators are very important. There are writers who write about perpetrators, Scott Strauss and John Hatzfield, and their work is very valuable. But sometimes it's very important that when work is often just about perpetrators and their own narratives, that we have to recognize that they have their own motivations for the narratives they're leaving behind, and that those narratives, what they're telling, whether politically motivated or motivated by their own personal guilt or motivated for whatever reasons, have to be tempered with also another side of the story in order to understand that these individual survivors will talk about growing up with an anti-Tutsi atmosphere. If we fail to hear that perspective, then we just hear the perspective of those killers, which leaves out things like anti-Tutsi perspective, which then gives us half of the story to understand the Rwandan genocide. So in that regard, Individual narratives are very important, both from the survivors and the perpetrators. But I do believe at this point, nobody is listening to Rwandan survivors in the country. It's a very small percentage of the population of 10 million people. There are a few 100,000. And that we failed them in 1994. We continue to fail them today, and that it's our obligation to go and listen to those who have lost everything because they want to share with outsiders and they want us to know. And so that's the purpose of the work we're doing in Rwanda, and ultimately to bring those narratives to people, and also ultimately to include narratives of perpetrators in educational curriculum, but starting with individuals as opposed to
Joyce.
Again, I think it's pretty complicated. A lot of education, Holocaust education, and there are, as you know, states that have Holocaust education, use what's referred to as effective education, and that is they get kids to cry. And I am very much against this and have written about it. And I don't think that that's the way you educate people, by making them necessarily feel so empathetic that they say, oh, now I understand. It's, again, extraordinarily complicated. The second issue is that I don't think you can exclude the issues of humiliation, loss of land, loss of territory, for example, right before Rwanda in the treaty that was being made, but also personal lack of sustainability, which is a problem. You know, we now have more internally displaced peoples in the world than we do refugees, and that part of the whole genocidal cauldron that's increasing is due to the fact of economic deprivation. That's an extraordinarily important piece. The psychological piece, of course, is important, but the economic piece is extraordinarily so. And that, again, this is something that educating about who are we educating? White, middle-class American children? What are we educating them for and about? These are really important issues to ask. You don't educate the same in Paterson, New Jersey, as you do in Ridgewood, New Jersey. You don't educate the same in Rwanda, Norway, Germany. So there are very different audiences, classes, voices that you have to, I think about in terms of the kinds of material you're bringing. And for children in displaced refugees camps all over the world, millions upon millions, I don't think testimonies are really where they need to be educated.
You know, I think that I'm terribly sorry, I'm going to have to leave.
Yeah.
You know, it's about, in my experience in talking about prevention, I've talked to all kinds of audiences. You have to acclimate to the audience. You have to address the audience, whether it's 8-year-old kids or whether it's professionals. I think you're absolutely right. We can't carry the same message for everyone. We have to really address specific classes, specific groups. I'm speaking of school classes. You know, I'm terribly sorry, but I've got to.
Patricia, last comment. How can we?
And education, one thing that occurs to me is the stories that really inspire and thrill us are the stories of Schindler and Raoul Wallenberg and the Armistice. You know, it's very important, I think, when we were educating in the United States, when we had our whole multicultural movement, for minority children to see themselves represented in our stories. But more than that, not to see themselves and their ancestors as victims, but to see the resistors and to see the stories of heroism.
Yeah. I think that actually applies in Cambodia, where there is a general view, I think, which is incorrect, that Cambodians didn't fight back against the Khmer Rouge.
Yeah.
And if there was more attention given to the ones who did fight back, the shame perhaps of people who were considered perpetrators because they belonged to the same ethnic group as the perpetrators would be much lessened, and the humiliation and the resentfulness of being targeted or described as being perpetrators, if they were able to point to members of their group who fought back, as some did, that would change things a lot. The same with Rwanda. I think the Rwandan genocide, as terrible as it was ended in 3 months by an uprising of Rwandans.
I think
it
we ought
was
to
not
meet
ended.
tomorrow again.
I just want to say, I have to add this one thing. Genocides don't end when the killing ends, of course. There's a tremendous spillover effect. The refugees, the misuse of humanitarian aid. When in Rwanda, the role of the French, it goes on. So it's one of the things that's really important to keep in mind is that these are processes and they don't stop.
Thank you. I want to particularly move in now, and I couldn't help it, but I'm very much looking at it. I'm an analyst, Claire Steinberger, but I'm also a lawyer, and I was writing on the International Criminal Court, and I'm very much resonating with what you're saying. And I think what's interesting is you can get caught in looking at the perpetrator up here or the victims, and I think we'll lose. For me anyway, what's really big in is lost is the socio-political forces at a very large, even global level. And when I was writing the paper, I was asked, because I'm an analyst and this lawyer, a crazy bunch of heads, and when you really move into what I call the third level, you really begin to see the perpetuation of systems of power and class, et cetera, at a really international and global level. And it's certainly not enough to take victims or to take even The Hague and make it the story. It's much larger and much more latent than it appears. And the horror is that you talk about the U.S. in one way and you talk about something, but when you really look at what I call this last or third level, you see the perpetuation with your own country and the power. And we make a mistake because I think you saw what happened with the humiliation of 2001. When a country gets humiliated, you can become and turn around, and it became very frightening for a lot of people here, and the word fascism was being used quite frequently. And you can see the anti-immigrant here. You saw us rush off to Iraq and bomb a whole country for a month. You don't know who you killed or what happened. So I think we really, for me anyway, another level of this other level, whether you use humiliation from an individual or from a group, all right? But I think also this whole idea that we could be missing a much larger political and economic and so forth level in the discussion, and you're not eliminating.
Okay.
That's why.
I think we've run out of time. Thank you very much.
Further information about our programs and a complete archive of past Philoctetes events is available at philoctetes.org.